Mr Chairman.
The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. May I respond to some of the points that have already been made? I will start with those that have most recently been made by Alistair Scott. Piece rates already exist for employees. Just because you can't get the minimum wage for picking an apple an hour. There is a piece rate that applies and is agreed by the employer and the employee that is reasonable, and if after having agreed that piece rate you actually go out there and pick an apple an hour, you don't get the piece rate and you don't get the minimum wage. So let's not pretend that somehow this would be different. The same logic and legal language is implied here in respect of a contractual arrangement that is a piece rate. So I think that argument is a nonsense. In respect of the idea that the problem doesn't exist, we know there is a gap in the law. The only question is, how often are people being abused? There is no doubt that some people are being abused, and indeed the Select Committee conceded that. The Select Committee conceded that some people are being abused in this relationship. We don't know how many. Now, I'm personally convinced it's rising. I think we are seeing more exploitative practices, especially in Auckland. Some of them are associated with desperate people. Some of those desperate people are here on student visas, and they're more open to exploitation than people that have other support structures around them if this is your own country. There is no doubt this is happening. It's just a question of how much. What were some of the instances that we heard at Select Committee? We heard an instance of a gym who had fitness trainers who were employees, who were put off as employees, taken on as contractors, and they didn't think they were getting the minimum wage. We had some other examples that have been given to me by law centres in other industries. Why don't we see this coming forward? Well, virtually every one of these instances, the person that gets the payment is a party to tax fraud. If they're getting paid less than the minimum wage, and the tax isn't being deducted at source, you can bet your bottom dollar that they are not going to the tax department and paying their tax. So they're complicit in tax fraud. They're never going to come forward and say, ping me for the tax I didn't pay on the wages that I got, or the payment that I got was less than the minimum wage. The idea that people have remedies in practice because they might be an employee rather than a contractor, and here I want to concede the point that Alistair Scott made, that some of the people that are being abused, even if the pretence is that they are a contractor, at law they probably are an employee if the legal test is applied properly. But in reality they have no effective remedy. They have no effective remedy for a number of reasons. The old guardians of these things aren't their guardian now. Most of these practices never occurred in yesteryear because we had high rates of union coverage, and the unions were effectively the police that stopped this happening. You didn't actually have to rely upon labour inspectors. We had advice from the Department of Labour as to whether the labour inspectors are active in this space. They readily conceded that the labour inspectors actually go after bigger issues that are systemic rather than in respect of the issues of one person. The number of prosecutions we see that come into that category would be able to be recorded on my fingers. I wouldn't have to go to my toes every year throughout New Zealand. The ones like the Masala prosecution last year, people being paid $2 an hour. $2 an hour. I think that's disgraceful. I'm sure everyone in this House think it's disgraceful. But we've had other instances. One of my colleagues, in the light of this bill, came up to me just a couple of weeks ago and said another one had come into his office. This was a person, again, this person had come into his office and said, I'm being offered remuneration where I've got to effectively take it as a contractual rate for a fixed dollar amount per day, which is much less than the minimum wage. My own secretary in my office, Deb Thornton, who I've worked for 10 years, recently came to me and said her son's flatmate in Auckland, again the same thing, and this time in the hospitality industry, doing dishes or waiting tables, $50 for the night, no matter whether you're there 5 hours or 8 hours. This is happening. And when I hear the National Party members saying, well, it might not be that bad, there's not that often happening, it sounds to me a bit like the people, and I'm not saying it is quite this bad, but in the old days, you know, when they tried to get rid of slavery, the people who ran those businesses said, oh, it'd be terrible costs for me to have to pay for people rather than to employ them as slaves. And then I'm sure there was, Mr. Chairman, I'm sure that there would be some people who at that said, well, it doesn't matter if there are only a few slaves, because that's effectively what we're saying here. So long as the number of people who are in this vulnerable position is not huge, so long as it's, you know, that the number of people being exploited is not large, it's okay. That's not right. The principle here is that people ought not to be able to get around the minimum wage by employing people in taking people on in contractual relationships. And that is what is at the heart of the ILO rule that Jonathan Young read out. The bit at the end about saying you shouldn't stop non-employment relationships, this doesn't stop non-employment relationships. You can still have contractual relationships. You just can't pay them less than the minimum wage. That's all this does. Nothing more. In respect of the pamphleteers, I agreed to that amendment because, you know, I really valued the support of New Zealand First. I'm not sure it's right. Maybe we need to tidy up the issues around piece rates for people. What's that? Well, no. What Clayton Mitchell said was that there are people who are elderly who choose to do this for a bit of pin money and a bit of social experience, and that they should be able to take longer than a piece rate would allow. I personally think a piece rate would protect that situation, but I agreed to that in order to get the support of New Zealand First. I do think that might be an area of law that we need to tidy up, because I think a piece rate should be able to be used in that situation. What about the competitive effects? What about the radio station that also sells advertising instead of the pamphleteer? If the radio station has to pay the minimum wage to all their employees, why shouldn't the competing advertiser who's stuffing pamphlets through letterboxes have to pay the minimum wage? We're on a race to the bottom in New Zealand because we still think we're the fair country that we were 30 years ago. We're not that country now, and we haven't updated our laws to reflect it. We need to update our laws to reflect it so that the most vulnerable people cannot be abused by tow rags, and they are tow rags, who will employ people for less than the minimum wage in order to improve the profitability or sustain their business. Some of them will say, we'll go broke. Well, that's true of any business who can't afford to pay someone the minimum wage. You don't drive down wages in a high-income society by allowing less than those minimum. The final thing I would say, sir, in respect of the idea that people can go to the Employment Authority and get a remedy, I've spoken to Labor barristers who operate in this area. They say in the rare cases that do that, because most of these people, as I said, they're vulnerable, they haven't got the skills or the money to do it, and they've probably been complicit in tax fraud because they haven't paid their tax on the money that they've earned. When they do go, if they've got a written agreement, the Employment Authority understandably puts a lot of weight on the written form of the agreement. And even though you might think that it's an employment relationship, if it's written up as a contract, it's very hard to get over the written form of the contract in practice, even though theoretically at common law an underlying test should be applied. So, sir, I think that there are people being abused by these sorts of relationships. I think it's on the rise in New Zealand. I think this sort of corruption should be stamped out, and I think this bill would be a good way to do it.
I'm going to call Kevin Haig.